So by now, we all know what's going on in China. There have been mass protests on the streets calling for the end of the Chinese government and more importantly, for the lockdowns to end. And we have to discuss this very topic today regarding why there have been protests going on and what is China going to do about it and if this will force the Communist Party to reopen the country. Now, if you didn't know by now, the protest was sparked by a deadly fire in Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang, that claimed the lives of at least 10 people. And it was because of the severe lockdown measures China imposed on the city, right? And because of this incident, there has been multiple protests erupting across China, including major cities like Shanghai and Beijing. And the protesters, they are demanding for the lockdowns to end and for the resignation of President Xi. But will the Chinese government fold under such pressure? Will China fully reopen to the whole world? Now, obviously, the incident in Xinjiang is a tragedy, but we have to understand the root causes that led to the lockdowns and if it's even feasible for China to immediately end the lockdowns, because it's not that simple. Even if the country reopens, the world economy could still be doomed to a recession. There might be no escaping the fate that awaits us in 2023. And when we look into why China is having these prolonged lockdowns, we need to start right at the beginning of the outbreak, and I'll quickly summarize it. Now, at the start, China was actually winning the fight while the West was suffering early. Infections in mainland China were well below 1,000 cases a day. Remember, China's population is over 1.4 billion people compared to America's 330 million. So that's a very big wide gap. But because of this early success, China made a mistake. They didn't finish vaccinating the population, especially the elderly. We can see vaccination rates for the elderly in the mainland is well below the rest of Asia, such as Hong Kong and Japan. Plus, we need to realize that China's hospitals are unprepared, with only around 4 critical care beds per 100,000 people. Their population is just too big. So the low level of immunity plus inadequate healthcare is making it tough for China to reopen to the world. And that's why there are still mass lockdowns around, because the government just couldn't afford to just declare victory and stop all the restrictions, right? There will likely be a surge and huge mortality rates which will just destroy the country's economy. But here's the big question. Have the protests worked? Will the Chinese government give in, stop the lockdowns tomorrow and just roll the dice? Now, personally, I don't think so. Neither do I think the Communist Party is going to get ousted anytime soon. And this is the thing about such headlines, stuff like China's going to crash in 30 days or America's downfall is next week. All those are YouTube clickbait titles to draw in the clicks. You know, it is what it is. However, we need to confront reality. No country, especially the big powers, are that fragile, and if any change is to happen, it'll take a lot of time, it'll take years and decades. But we are beginning to see the Chinese government start to listen to their citizens. Maybe it's a bit forced, but they are starting to listen. There have been some restrictions lifted in Guangzhou and Chongqing as a result of the protests. We have one of China's senior officials, Sun Chunlan, mentioning how China's pandemic containment faces a new stage and mission. And 24 districts in Shanghai designated as high risk were also released from the lockdown measures. So it seems that China might be trying to tiptoe towards a full reopening of the country. But just because China reopens doesn't mean the world economy is going to be safe. Even if the lockdowns end today, it'll take some time for their industries to ramp up before things get back into high gear. And right now, there's a lot of confusion in the markets, with one camp believing the protests will doom China and we're going to see an economic meltdown, while the other believes the reopening will happen in early 2023 and now is the time to go long and invest in China. However, we need to take a step back and really analyze what a reopening of China could mean, because the result might just shock you. And because of the lockdowns, China has up to a fifth of its GDP locked away, and this is damaging the economy. We have the PMI shrinking over the past few months, and this isn't a good sign for their manufacturing. In fact, it is shrinking. And this means output from China is suppressed, plus millions of businesses, they are no longer operating. So if China does reopen, the general idea is that the Chinese people, they'll rush out to spend, and that spending will boost GDP growth in many countries. They'll buy lots of stuff from Europe and begin importing tons of American-made goods. And remember that China is one of America's biggest trading partners, so the hope is that whatever the US sells, China will buy to help US companies stay afloat and contribute to US GDP. And this will help them avoid a recession. But let's realize that China's reopening isn't going to be instant, and not everyone will have the purchasing power or the mindset to just spend like drunken sailors. Youth unemployment in China is close to 18%, and that's very high. And this means overseas spending probably isn't going to be a priority. The rich in China, yeah, they will spend for sure, but the masses aren't going to go crazy with their wallets. People will spend more locally because prices will be cheaper. And remember that all currencies are crashing against the dollar. They have crashed quite badly. And the same goes for the Chinese yuan, which is down by almost 10%. So it will cost more to import goods, especially from the United States. And we have to talk about the hope of disinflation for the world economy if China reopens. Now, the narrative once again goes something along the lines of China starting to manufacture more stuff and flooding the world with a generous supply of goods. And we can see China's exports falling by 0.3% in October. When production ramps up, we should see exports just go through the roof, right? However, is that the type of stuff that will save the world economy? China's main exports are manufactured goods like TVs, furniture, plastics, and machinery. And in the US alone, the biggest contributor to inflation is energy prices and food prices. And China is the world's biggest consumer of energy. So even if prices of consumer goods goes down in America because of Chinese exports or cheap manufacturing, we are going to see the demand for energy go through the roof. Plus, if China's exports increase, the main beneficiaries will be the Chinese companies because prices will generally be cheaper versus the rest of the world. Remember that China has access to cheap energy from Russia. They are buying oil and gas at massive discounts so they can outprice the world. We have to understand that reopening China will be more awesome for the Chinese economy because they can be more competitive versus the world. Their reopening can actually jack energy prices without suffering higher energy inflation themselves. But here's the kicker, China has not been idle during this period of lockdowns. They have been going out into the world cutting energy deals because they know they have to reopen sooner or later. And I think this is the missing piece of the puzzle that many people aren't seeing. There have been a lot of chess moves China has been doing behind the lockdowns and actually using it to their advantage. They have been securing their energy future by signing oil and gas partnerships in the Middle East, like their recent 27-year LNG deal with Qatar. They are also de-risking their reserves by dumping treasuries and selling dollars to defend the Chinese yuan. To date, they have sold over $130 billion worth of US bonds, and a large part is probably moving to gold. Now, China is in a position where they can't raise rates like the rest of the world. They are still trying to manage their property bubble and to prevent a horrific crash. Property prices for new built homes in China, they have been falling for 2 quarters straight, and higher rates will just crush the market. We have Chinese leaders looking to shift towards GDP growth and slowly transitioning the people away from the lockdowns even though cases are surging. And according to many analysts, economic conditions are worsening and policymakers' pain point is being reached. Now, if Chinese lawmakers change their language and they set economic targets for 2023 during the Politburo meeting, we're going to see a reopening of the country. It's going to be much faster than we expect. Now, a lot of economists, they are predicting China's growth to plunge overall this year, but rebound and hit 4.9% in 2023. And there's a very good chance it could happen. Now, the protests over the last week might have been the wake-up call the government needed to accelerate the process. China's central banks also focus on growth, and that means they're going to keep easing. Yes, this is inflationary, but they want to spur spending and get businesses moving, right? It's like trying to kickstart an engine after it has been dormant for too long. So if you're an investor and you're thinking of getting into the Chinese markets, this might be a turning point. We have Chinese stocks like Alibaba on a tear, rising nearly 20% in just a week after the protest breaks out. And the rest of the world, the US and Europe, they're all hiking rates while China is easing. So at least the initial GDP boost from a lower bar could see China grow faster than the rest of the world when they open up. But the ride will be very rocky, especially if the Chinese government opens up too fast. And I think we have to watch the vaccination rates in the country. Now, the biggest hurdle right now is the elderly, with only 65% of them being vaccinated. Now, China is organizing drives for the population to get their shot, but it's going to take time. The target is for 90% of people over 80 years old to have at least one dose by January 2023, and that's very ambitious. And when that target is reached, I think we'll see a faster reopening of China. But the main beneficiary of this will be China itself, and we have to understand this. They already have cheap energy flowing from Russia, and if demand spikes, they can just knock on Putin's door and ask for more. And because of the sanctions and the price cap on Russian oil coming, China's the main outlet for Putin's oil. And right now, the dollar has fallen quite a bit against global currencies. But if China reopens, it's going to send the dollar tumbling down even further. We're going to see money flow into the yuan in order to invest in the Chinese economy. And if China pushes for more bilateral trade, especially now that they have more goods and services. This will strengthen their currency further. And we have to understand what China has already been doing over the last few months. They have been actively selling treasuries, conducting lots of trade with Russia using the yuan, pushing aside the dollar and the euro. So if China does reopen and they start trading the yuan, that is another form of de-dollarization. But this move is contingent on China ending their lockdowns and managing the transition well, which is a tall order, is still a very big challenge. Now, protests in China aren't a good look for them. Any protest anywhere isn't a wonderful thing. And it's a tragedy what happened to the people in the Urumqi fire. I personally think the lockdown measures, the way they handled it, the way they implemented it, has gone too far. And even though China has a lot to gain when it reopens, it's still a dangerous tightrope walk where anything can go wrong if the government opens too slowly or if it does so too fast. And they know that eternal lockdowns do not work anymore. And the Chinese people are starting to show great anger at the people in power. They have to accelerate their timetable. Now, the protests are a reflection of a China ready to reopen. People are tired of getting cooped up at home, and the Chinese government needs to adapt and do it quickly. But I have to emphasize that China isn't going to collapse in 31 days. No country is collapsing tomorrow. But I see this as a wake-up call for China to readjust their strategy to reopen the country and their economy. And I want us to remember that energy prices, as high as they currently are, they are being suppressed by China's lockdowns. So don't be surprised if energy demand surges and inflation goes crazy once again when China reopens. So let me know what you think. Will China be forced to reopen early? Will the protests work and end the lockdowns? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.